You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Now, the last episode I talked about critical thinking, and I thought I'd demonstrate to you how we might be able to put that into practice. And what the topic that I've chosen is actually a bit sort of technical and complex, although like a lot of technical and complex terms these days, much of it ends up in colloquial layperson's language. And so I want to draw out how that's at times a positive, but it can also be a serious challenge, especially for those of us in the medical and psychiatric and psychological profession, because we are, after all, attempting to deal more with specifics rather than necessarily broad brush issues. So what am I talking about? Well, fundamentally, I want to address the issue about neurodiversity and neurotypical. Okay, so let me kick off with looking at what is it that we actually mean by those terms. Okay, so let me start off with neurodiverse. So essentially, neurodiverse is actually about a movement, and you know, we can refer to it as the neurodiversity movement, and it originated in the late 1990s as an offshoot of the disability rights movement. It initially gained traction amongst individuals with autism and also their allies. Still, its scope since then has really broadened out and now includes a range of neurological conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's syndrome, and a number of others. So the term neurodiversity was actually coined by an Australian sociologist, Judy Singer, who herself is on the autism spectrum. Now, the movements leveraged the power of the internet to connect like-minded individuals who basically were like scattered geographically, but who shared common experiences and common goals. So very briefly, let me explain what the neurodiversity movement established as goals. So the first thing was about destigmatization. So that was the primary, or at least one of the primary objectives, to bring issues to the forefront, take out the stigma about stuff that we consider to be neurologically different. So the movement suggests that these differences are not disorders to be cured, but are instead natural variations within the human genome. The other goals were to be inclusive, process of self-advocacy, influence policy, so the advocacy for legislative changes to accommodate neurological differences in various sectors like education, employment, healthcare. They are also pretty significant. Another goal was public awareness, educating the general population about the realities of neurodiverse conditions, and is considered crucial for reducing ignorance, prejudice, and unintentional harm. Okay? And the other two goals, well, one was celebration of diversity. That is, we're not all the same. We have various backgrounds, we have various strengths, we have various weaknesses. And also the other part of it is to get individualized support. Okay, so, you know, tailored support mechanisms that recognize the unique needs and potential of each neurodiverse individual as opposed to a one-size-fits-all approach. So that's essentially the idea about neurodiversity. So we're not necessarily talking about a label that was coined from neuroscience, but it actually came out of sociology. Now, I want you to recognize that I am not denigrating that. I'm just saying there's a difference, and I'm going to explain in a minute what that difference may be about from the sociological to the psychological and the neuroscientific point of view. So essentially, what we're looking for then is what's neurotypical. Well, that's the flip side of the coin. And essentially, it's someone who doesn't have any of those other neurological conditions, to put it, in a very simple term. Okay, so it's fundamentally there to describe individuals whose neurological development and functioning are generally consistent with what's considered the social norm. Okay, now it gets a little bit more complicated, folks. So let's go away from the idea of definition and look at some critical thinking around this. Okay, so what are the challenges that these terms pose? Now, firstly, the very first thing I think that we need to consider is the fact that they're really broad, right? So having very broad definitions can create both research as well as clinical problems. So if we go down and say, okay, we're neurodiverse, so it's essentially that it's not one size fits all label, especially when we're talking about things like autism, ADD, ADHD. There's a whole range of symptoms and functioning within a single condition. So if I then take up the idea of the term neurotypical, it implies a certain standard of normalcy. But the question is, should it? Right? One could probably argue quite well, and I'm sure a lot of neuroscientists are on board with this, is that what really constitutes a normal human brain, a normal neurological functioning? We'd probably find that there are some particularly important differences, since we often talk about neuroplasticity, so environment shaping the brain, shaping function. And there's lots of adaptive behaviors that emerge from that. So from an epidemiological point of view, this makes research and clinical definitions really tricky. So, the term's really broad. It supposes heterogeneity, which is one size fits all, and it conflates with normalcy, okay? Now, as a psychologist, I frequently sort of suggest to people that when you say to me normal, it has vastly different implications. And I'll probably go, yes, but what's normal, okay? So let me then take a bit of a dive into why would I critique this as a clinician, right? So one of the big issues here is in the realm of diagnosis and treatment. So in the clinical world, a broad label can sometimes do more harm than good. It also makes it very, very difficult a lot of times in getting the client to engage with what we're trying to achieve. What is it that we're trying to do? So, for example, in ADHD, one of the features is the lack of capacity to focus, concentrate, and in fact to have this really, really busy mind that doesn't seem to be able to sort of quieten down. Now, I can argue that that's very common with anybody who's got an anxiety disorder as well. So what are we then talking about? Are we talking about people who have those symptoms fundamentally as being anxious, or are they suffering from ADD, ADHD. So it gets touchy, or it gets, difficult. Because the other thing that now comes into play is, well, what sort of treatment are we going to apply, or, are we going to suggest to the client in that case? So, we don't have very, good pharmacological solutions for someone with an anxiety disorder, because a lot of the stuff's addictive. However, if you present with the issue that you've got ADD, ADHD, then the front line intervention often is Ritalin, dexamphetamine, that sort of medication. And, that constitutes a whole range of issues. So, diagnosis and treatment now are sensitive areas. And so treatment planning really becomes quite, at times, controversial even. So the problem with all of this, and it doesn't end with diagnosis and treatment, but we've also got to consider resources. So, how are planners going to, work on developing appropriate resource delivery? And of course, there's ethical considerations as well. These terms aren't just descriptive. They have particular implications. So things like stigmatization and marginalization. In a clinical setting, the use of broad labels like neurodiverse can present several challenges. And some of that, whether intentional or not, can present with cognitive biases. So, if I really come and take a step back as a clinician and go, well, what's my main challenge in diagnosis? There's basically three in this area: lack of specificity, overlapping symptoms, and potential for overshadowing. So what do I mean here? Okay, so lack of specificity is already a term that may not provide enough information for me as a clinician to arrive at a detailed diagnosis. Medicine often requires a high level of specificity, and so does psychiatry and psychological sciences it's particularly to understand the underlying issues and therefore recommend appropriate interventions. So how discriminating am I going to be when a client presents to me with lack of focus, lack of attention, lack of motivation, and at the same time I'm sort of going, yes, is that patient or is that client anxious, or are they suffering from ADD? Because I'm going to have to make a decision about whether I'm going to send them off to get medication or whether I'm going to begin to work with them in a non-medicated sense. So overlapping symptoms, again, attention difficulties could be attributed to ADHD, but they're also a common feature of autism as well as anxiety. So without a more specific framework, I, as a clinician, risk misdiagnosing somebody. So the potential for overshadowing, well, this is an area where individual symptoms might actually be crucial for a diagnosis. For example, an individual with autism may also experience anxiety, but if they're broadly categorized as neurodiverse, those specific symptoms might not get the attention that they actually need. So let's take it further into treatment planning. So firstly, we need to recognize that one size does not fit all. Mental health treatment is often highly individualized. So I need to be able to treat each client according to their own needs. The second bit is this whole issue about resource allocation. General labels can also impact on how healthcare resources are allocated. Funding and other services might be earmarked for the neurodiverse, but what works for one condition may be entirely unsuitable for another. The other area is influence and therapeutic goals. The use of broad labels, and remember, neurodiverse and neurotypical are broad labels. They may influence the setting of therapeutic goals and expectations, both for the clinician and the patient or the client. So a label might limit a clinician's perception of what a patient is capable of achieving, or conversely set unrealistic expectations. So this, from a clinical point of view, could be setting the person up for failure, both the clinician and the client. Now, the final thing that is really important here is the ethical concerns. If this isn't navigated carefully, these labels can contribute to the stigmatization or marginalization of clients. Being categorized as neurodiverse could be a way of pathologizing that person, which is what the movement didn't want in the first place. But inadvertently, it can actually do that. While on the other hand, being neurotypical might be idealized and affecting the quality and equity of healthcare provision. So, to put it in a nutshell, while terms like neurodiverse and neurotypical have a significant value in social discourse and advocacy, their utility in a clinical setting is actually limited, mainly because of the challenges they present in diagnosis and treatment planning. So this highlights the importance of using more specific descriptors and diagnostic criteria in clinical practice, which also raises the issue of the integrity and the value of the DSM-5 in the first place. And there's a podcast in that alone, because the originator of the DSM-5, the person who worked on it fundamentally, who wrote the thing, has actually come out and critiqued this document, which is the foundation for most psychologists in the Anglo-Saxon world to make diagnoses. And he's been very, very critical of that particular book, I guess, or approach. So we need to think about these carefully. So have a think about this, because this is a really good example of using critical thinking. And yes, it is in the realm of professional critical thinking. And there are lots of examples of using critical thinking in other areas of our lives where we don't need to have complex degrees and, training and education and experience. But I thought I'd use this because, again, people take these labels on face value without necessarily thinking them through, thinking about what they actually mean, what they imply, what the consequences are of using those more broadly. So, fundamentally, that's it for this episode. I hope you found this interesting and a bit enlightening. And, I want to encourage you, don't miss the next week's episode, where we're going to explore another thought-provoking topic, because it is, about changing our thinking, or at least about understanding not just what we think, but how we think it and how it hangs together. Without that, there will be no constructive change. It's a bit like rethinking patriarchy, rethinking what it is that we mean by sex, gender. And all of these areas have not just individual implications, but they have social implications. They have economic and political implications. And so, I hate to say it, but life isn't easy. It's complex. And our world has become progressively more and more and more and more complex. Let's try to at least understand it a bit better. So this is me signing off. Until next time, I hope you'll be listening. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.guntersvoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.